Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today with a feeling that I think is pretty universal.
Oh boy. I know where this is going.
Yeah, you know that sinking feeling in your stomach when you're maybe about 3 months into a project at work?
Right?
Everyone is incredibly busy. The Slack channels are just blowing up. Money is definitely leaving the bank account. But if someone actually pinned you against a wall and asked what you've actually finished,
You wouldn't really have a good answer.
exactly, you've got nothing to show for it.
It's the classic busy but not productive trap. Just a complete nightmare.
It really is. And, our source material today lists the usual suspects for this: lack of coordination, poor communication, terrible time estimation, and my personal favorite, delivering products which are just totally unacceptable or unusable.
Yeah, the old we built it exactly to spec but nobody actually wants it
Yeah.
problem. Which usually ends in what the industry affectionately calls the death march. Late nights, cut corners.
Right. So today we are diving into a methodology that claims to actually solve this. It's called PRINCE2. And I have to be honest, when I first saw the acronym, I just thought, great, another buzzword salad for corporate managers.
I get that reaction all the time. I mean, it sounds incredibly bureaucratic on the surface, but if you actually dig into the history, it was born out of exactly that chaos we were just talking about.
So what does it actually stand for?
Projects in controlled environments.
Which is just a very polite British way of saying, let's stop running around like headless chickens.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
It was originally established by the CCTA, which is a UK government agency, back in 1989. It effectively superseded an older system called PROMP because, their IT projects were just failing at a spectacular rate. They desperately needed a way to control the uncontrollable.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack how PRINCE2 provides this framework, because the core promise here is really interesting. It completely separates the management of a project from the specialist work.
And that is the crucial distinction.
Right, because usually we think the work itself is the project. Like if I'm building a website, the coding is the project.
And that's the trap right there. If you're building a website, the coding is the specialist work. If you're building a house, pouring the foundation is the specialist work.
Okay.
PRINCE2 argues that the layer above that, the actual decision-making, the risk control, figuring out who does what that layer is universal. So whether it's a website or a house, the management layer should look exactly the same.
So it's like a container. You can put literally anything inside the container, but the walls of the container, the actual rules, those stay the same.
Exactly. And honestly, whether you're listening to this and you're running some massive government initiative or you're just trying to get your 5-person team to agree on a Friday deadline, this method offers a common language for success.
Let's get into the philosophy of it then. How does PRINCE2 actually define a project? Because I know they have a very specific take on it.
They do. They define it as a management environment created for the purpose of delivering one or more business products according to a specified business case.
Okay, so there's a lot packed in there. Management environment, business products, business case. Let's break down the organization part first, because this is where I feel like most projects fail before they even get off the ground.
Oh, absolutely. We've all been in those agonizing meetings where, there's 8 people in the room, but nobody knows who can actually say yes or no to a budget increase.
The dreaded decision by committee, where you just keep scheduling follow-up meetings until everyone literally loses the will to live.
Right. So PRINCE2 tackles this by saying a project board shouldn't just be a collection of fancy job titles. It has to represent 3 very distinct interests. Imagine a tripod. If you kick out one of the legs, the whole thing falls over.
Okay, let's walk through the tripod. Who has to be at the table?
So the first leg is the business interest.
Mm.
This is the executive. They really only have one job, and that's ensuring value for money. They're constantly asking, is this project still worth the investment?
So they're the ones holding the purse strings.
Exactly. They own the business case. If the project stops making financial sense, it is their explicit job to kill it.
Brutal, but necessary. Okay, what's the second leg?
The user interest. This is represented by the senior user. They are the voice of the people who will actually have to work with whatever it is you're building. They specify the needs. Their big question is, will this product actually work for us?
I feel like this is the one that gets ignored the most. Like, we've all seen software rolled out by corporate IT that clearly no one ever bothered to test on a real human being.
Exactly. That happens when the senior user isn't on the board. The business person says, hey, it's cheap. The supplier says, hey, I can build it. But nobody stops to ask if it's actually usable.
Which brings us perfectly to the third leg, the supplier.
Right, the senior supplier. They represent the people providing the resources and the skills. Their question is, can we actually build this thing with the time and the people we have?
So you have the money, which is the business, the need, which is the user, and the ability, which is the supplier.
You got it. And those three interests make up the project board. They make the big overarching decisions, like committing resources or authorizing the next phase of work. But, and this is a massive but, they do not run the project.
Right, because having three bosses trying to run a daily stand-up meeting would just be total chaos.
Exactly. The day-to-day running of the project belongs entirely to the project manager. And PRINCE2 is incredibly strict about this rule. The project manager role cannot be shared.
So it's basically the one neck to choke philosophy.
I mean, ideally, we'd say one point of accountability, but yes, essentially. You can have a committee for the board, but you can only have one driver at the wheel. And this all exists within what PRINCE2 calls a customer-supplier environment.
Meaning someone is paying for it and someone is building it.
Right. And those could be two totally different companies. Or they could just be two different departments within your own company. The dynamic is the same.
I want to push back on this board structure just a little bit. I mean, executive, senior user, senior supplier, project manager, it sounds amazing for a giant defense contract, but does this actually translate if you're, say, a tech startup with 10 people? Do you really need a formal board?
You absolutely need the structure, yes, but you don't need the formality. So in a startup, the executive might just be the founder. The senior user might be your head of customer support. The senior supplier might be your lead engineer. The point isn't to print out fancy new business cards.
It's about making sure the perspectives are covered.
Precisely. It's about ensuring those three voices, money, usability, and feasibility, are all heard before you write a single line of code. Because if you ignore the user hat just because you're moving fast, you end up building a product nobody wants. And that kills startups just as fast as it kills government projects.
That makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned earlier that the executive owns the business case. In my experience, a business case is usually this really dense document you write up just to get funding, and then it gets shoved in a digital drawer and no one ever looks at it again.
And that right there is exactly why projects turn into zombie projects. They just keep walking around eating brains and budget long after they should have been put out of their misery.
Because nobody's actually checking to see if they still make sense in the real world.
Right. PRINCE2 flips that. It treats the business case as the driver of the entire project. It's not a static document. It has to answer the question, why should this project be done? And the benefits don't even have to just be financial.
Oh, really? What else could they be?
They could be strategic, like we need to enter this new market. Or they could be legislative, like the government just passed a new privacy law, and if we don't update our servers, we'll get sued.
Ah, okay. So it's the core justification, whatever that happens to be.
Exactly. And because the world changes, the business case has to be dynamic. It must be updated at key points throughout the project, especially at stage boundaries.
Give me an example of how that works in practice.
Okay, let's say you're building a massive new factory to manufacture fax machines.
Bold business move for the 2020s, but I'm tracking with you.
Right. So you start the project, but halfway through construction, email suddenly becomes the global standard. Now, a traditional project manager might just put their head down and say, well, we're 50% done. Let's make sure we finish this factory on time and on budget.
The classic sunk cost fallacy. We spent the money, so we have to finish the thing.
Exactly. But PRINCE2 says absolutely not. At the end of that stage, the executive has to look at the updated business case and say, look, the market for fax machines just vanished. The business case is no longer valid. We need to stop the project immediately.
And under this methodology, stopping that project is actually considered a success.
A huge success. Because you just saved the remaining 50% of the budget. If the business case is invalid, the project stops. It is the ultimate control mechanism.
Okay, so we've got our team, and we've got our living, breathing reason for doing the work. Let's actually talk about planning the work, because this is the part of the research that I found really fascinating. It totally flips the traditional to-do list on its head with something called product-based planning.
It's a massive mindset shift. Most people start planning a project by asking, what do we need to do? So they just start listing activities. I need to draft a brief, I need to call the vendor, I need to set up the server.
Which feels really productive. You're ticking boxes, you're getting things done.
But you can tick 1,000 boxes and still not have a working product at the end. PRINCE2 says, don't start with what you're doing. Start with what you are making. Start with the product.
Let's use an analogy here. Give me an example of the difference between the two.
Think about buying a piece of flat pack furniture, like from IKEA. When you open that box, do you just immediately grab the little Allen wrench and start twisting screws into whatever piece of wood is closest?
Definitely not. I look at the picture on the front of the manual to see what the finished bookshelf is actually supposed to look like, and then I check the parts list to make sure I have all the individual shelves and brackets.
Exactly. And that is product-based planning. You identify the products first. The finished shelf, the brackets, the screws. That's what PRINCE2 calls the product breakdown structure. Only after you know what the products are, do you figure out the sequence of how they fit together.
Which I assume is the product flow diagram?
Spot on. You determine the sequence of production, and then finally you figure out the activities required to make it happen.
So translating that to a corporate environment, instead of just saying, hey, let's have a meeting to write the Q3 report, you actually define the report as a product first.
Yes. And you don't just say a report, you write a product description. How long is it? Who is the audience? What specific data points must it contain? Once everyone agrees on what the product is, figuring out the activities to create it is actually really easy.
But if you just say, write a report,
The person comes back 2 weeks later with a 50-page manifesto when all you wanted was a one-page summary.
and then you have to redo the whole thing, which wastes time and money. It's so simple, but it makes so much sense. Now, once we have that, the research mentions a hierarchy of plans. It's not just one giant master schedule.
No, because different people need different levels of detail. So PRINCE2 breaks it down. You have the project plan, which is a high-level overview. That's for the project board to look at. Then you have the stage plan.
Because projects are broken up into stages, right?
Exactly. Management stages. The stage plan is the highly detailed plan for just the current stage you are in. That's what the project manager uses day to day. And then optionally, you can have a team plan, which is the really nitty-gritty detail for people actually doing the specialist work.
Let's dig into these management stages for a second. Because the sources call them fire breaks.
That's a great way to think of them. They are mandatory review points. The project board does not give the project manager all the money up front. They only commit resources one stage at a time.
So it's like an allowance.
Basically, at the end of a stage, you have an end-stage assessment. The board reviews what was just finished, checks the business case, and if everything looks good, they authorize the next stage. If things are going off the rails, the fire break stops the fire from spreading to the rest of the budget.
And I should clarify for the listeners, because the source material makes a big point of this. Management stages are not the same as technical stages.
Really important distinction. A technical stage might be design phase or build phase. A management stage is about commitment of resources. They don't always overlap perfectly. You might have 2 technical stages inside one management stage, depending on where the board wants to put a control point.
Okay, so we have these great plans and these neat little stages. But reality is messy. People get sick, servers crash, supply chains fall apart. How does PRINCE2 handle the chaos of the real world? Because a controlled environment sounds lovely in theory, but
things go wrong. They always go wrong. And that brings us to one of the most powerful concepts in PRINCE2, tolerance and management by exception. This is the ultimate cure for micromanagement.
let's hear it. Because if I'm a project manager, I really don't want the executive hovering over my shoulder asking why I spent $20 extra on printer paper.
And trust me, the executive doesn't want to be doing that either.
Yeah.
So the board sets what's called tolerance. Think of it like a sandbox. They say to the project manager, here is your budget for this stage, plus or minus 10%, and here is your deadline, plus or minus 2 weeks. Go play in the sandbox.
And as long as I stay inside that sandbox, I don't have to bother them.
Exactly. You have total authority to make decisions within those limits. But the crucial part is the moment you realize, and I mean the moment you forecast, that you're going to step outside that sandbox.
Like, I realize a vendor is going to charge us 20% more than we budgeted for.
Right. You stop. You don't hide it. You don't hope it gets better. You raise an exception report. You go to the board and say, I am forecasting that we will exceed tolerance. Here is why, and here are the options for what we can do about it.
So I bring them an exception plan.
Yes. And then you have a mid-stage assessment. The board meets, looks at the exception plan, and they have to make a choice. Do they approve the new plan and effectively build you a bigger sandbox? Or do they say the business case is ruined and kill the project?
I really love the parenting analogy for this.
It's the best way to visualize it. If my kids are playing quietly in their room, I don't need them coming out every 5 minutes giving me a status report. I picked up a block. I put down a block. That's exhausting.
I only need to know if they decide to paint the walls with a permanent marker.
Exactly. That is an exception. That's management by exception. It saves the manager's sanity, and it lets the board actually focus on strategy instead of babysitting.
So, along with tracking the budget and the time, there's another control mechanism mentioned: configuration management. Now, I have to admit, this sounds incredibly dry. It sounds like pure IT jargon. But the analogy in the source material about the vintage car actually made it click for me.
It's a surprisingly perfect analogy. Imagine you own a classic car, like a 1965 Mustang,
Hmm.
and the window winder breaks.
Okay.
You can't just walk into a random auto parts shop and say, hey, give me a window winder for a Mustang.
Hmm.
You need to know exactly which version of the car you have. Because in 1966, Ford might have changed the size of the screw hole by 2 millimeters.
Right. So if I buy the 1966 part, it's not going to fit my 1965 door.
Exactly. Configuration management is simply tracking and protecting the versions of your project's products. If you're building an app and your coding team is writing software for version 2.0, but your QA team is over there testing version 1.5.
You have a complete disaster on your hands. You're testing the wrong thing.
The golden rule is nothing moves, nothing changes without authorization. You have to know the exact current status of every single asset in your project. Otherwise, you are trying to fit a 66 part into a 65 car.
That naturally links to the idea of quality, too, because if you don't know what version you're working on, you definitely can't guarantee it works.
But PRINCE2 has a very specific definition of quality, right? It's not just about making something good.
No, because good is completely subjective. To a software engineer, good might mean it has a million features. To the finance department, good means it was cheap to build. PRINCE2 defines quality strictly as fitness for purpose.
So does it do the specific job it was designed to do?
Right. If you need a vehicle to haul dirt across a muddy field, a tractor is a high-quality product. A Ferrari is a low-quality product.
Even though the Ferrari is objectively more expensive and engineered better? Exactly, because it's not fit for the purpose. This goes right back to those product descriptions we talked about. You write the criteria down before you build the thing. Vehicle must be able to cross deep mud. If you deliver a Ferrari, it fails the quality review.
I love that because it stops what people call gold plating. You know, when specialists build in all these cool extra features that nobody actually asked for just because they can.
Which just drains time and money. And a big part of protecting that time and money is how you handle risk. PRINCE2 makes a really smart distinction here between business risk and project risk.
Break that down for me. What's the difference?
So business risk is what the project board worries about. These are strategic threats, like what if a competitor launches a similar product before we do? Or what if interest rates skyrocket?
Things outside the day-to-day work, so then project risk is what the project manager worries about.
Right. Will the supplier go bankrupt? Will the server parts be delayed in shipping? All this gets recorded in a central document called the risk log. You analyze it, and then you take action.
And there are 5 specific actions for risk, right? Prevention, reduction, transference, contingency, or acceptance.
You nailed it. Prevention is doing something so the risk can't happen. Reduction is making it less likely or less damaging. Transference is usually buying insurance or putting penalties in a vendor contract.
Making it someone else's problem.
Exactly. Contingency is having a backup plan ready to go. And acceptance is just looking at the risk and saying, you know what, the cost of fixing this is higher than the damage it would cause, so we'll just live with it if it happens.
It's all just so logical. Okay, I want to pull this all together now. We've talked about the roles, the planning, the controls, but sometimes reading this methodology can feel like drowning in alphabet soup. SU, IP, CS, DP.
It does get a little acronym heavy if you just read the manual straight through.
So let's ditch the acronyms for a second and walk through a real-world scenario. Let's trace the journey. Say you and I are launching a new chain of coffee shops. From the initial idea all the way to opening day, how does the PRINCE2 process model actually flow?
Okay, great example. So the very first phase happens before the project officially even starts. This is called starting up a project, or SU. Somebody, somewhere, has the initial idea. Hey, we should sell coffee.
Is this where we figure out who is in charge?
Yes. You appoint the executive and the project manager. And together, you create a very short document called a project brief. It basically just asks, is this a viable idea, and do we have a rough concept of what it will take?
So if the board looks at the brief and says, yes, this makes sense, then what?
Then we move into IP. which is initiating a project. This is where the heavy lifting of planning happens.
This is where we write the project initiation document, the PID.
Exactly. The PID is essentially the contract for the project. It answers the what, why, who, when, and how. You build the full business case. You define the quality standards like, are we selling premium organic beans or cheap diner coffee? You plan the timeline and the costs.
Okay, so the PID is done. The board signs off and says, go build the coffee shops. Now we're in the thick of it. The world splits into different processes here, right?
It does. The board moves into DP, directing a project. They step back. They authorize the stages, but mostly they just watch from the balcony, managing by exception. Meanwhile, you, the project manager, move into CS, controlling a stage.
So I'm the one actually assigning the work. I'm telling one team to design the interior, another team to order the espresso machines.
Right. You are authorizing work packages. And the teams receiving those packages are in the MP process, managing product delivery. They accept the work, they do the actual specialist work, and they deliver the finished products back to you.
Now, let's say the interior design phase is completely finished. That's a major milestone.
In PRINCE2, that is a stage boundary. So you enter the SP process, managing stage boundaries. Everything pauses. You report back to the board on what was just completed. And crucially, you update the business case.
So I might say to the board, the design is done and we are on budget, but the global price of coffee beans just doubled.
Exactly. And the board looks at that updated business case and decides if it's still worth opening shops. If they say yes, they authorize the next stage, and the cycle repeats. Plan, do, review.
Until eventually opening day arrives, the shop is built, the staff is trained, the customers are drinking coffee, we're done.
You're done building, but you're not quite finished with the project. You have to enter CP, closing a project.
And this is a step that I feel like almost everyone skips in the real world. They just drift away to their next assignment.
Which is a massive mistake. In a controlled close, you confirm acceptance. Does the senior user actually agree that the coffee shop is ready to run? You formally hand over the keys to the operational team. And most importantly, you write the lessons learned report.
Documenting what went right and what went wrong.
Right. If the espresso machine installation took 3 weeks instead of 1 because of plumbing issues, you record that. So the next time the company opens a shop, they know to hire the plumber 2 weeks earlier.
This actually brings me to my final thought for today. It's something that really struck me while going through the sources. We talk a lot about organizational memory.
Or usually, the complete lack of it.
Right. Most companies suffer from severe organizational amnesia. They make the exact same mistakes on Project B that they made on Project A, purely because nobody bothered to write anything down when they closed Project A.
It is painful to watch.
Mm-hmm.
Companies burn millions of dollars relearning lessons they already paid to learn once. PRINCE2 forces you to institutionalize that knowledge. You don't just finish a project, you formally pass on that wisdom to the rest of the organization.
So to the listeners out there, think about your own company. How much knowledge are you losing every single quarter just by moving on to the next task without capturing those lessons? It's probably more than you think.
Definitely. Look, PRINCE2 has a lot of terminology, products, stages, tolerances, but if you strip all that away, it really is just organized common sense.
It's about knowing what you're trying to achieve, knowing who is responsible for what, and having a built-in mechanism to stop the train before it goes off the cliff.
And realizing that sometimes the absolute best thing you can do for your organization is to look at a business case, recognize it's flawed, and have the courage to just say, let's stop.
Courage is definitely an underrated project management skill.
Oh.
Well, on that note, I'm going to go check the tolerance levels on my own to-do list for the day. I have a sneaking suspicion I'm already in exception territory.
You better write up an exception report then.
I'm on it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We will catch you in the next one.